welcome you all to tonight's Bible study. We've made our way through the first 19 chapters of Joshua. Man, it's been a great time. They've taken a little break in the fighting, and we're going to finish up the last 4 chapters, starting in chapter 20 tonight of Joshua, kind of wrap this whole thing up of taking the promised land, tie a little bow up in it, and then move on to the book of Judges tonight. The first thing we find in chapter 20, there you go, see. Somebody called, I've got somebody at north that does it for me, and somebody called me out here. Before we jump into what goes on, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Most wonderful and gracious Heavenly Father, God, we just love you so much, even if we forget to stop to speak to you from time to time. But God, you are a wonderful and an awesome God, and knowing more about you is our desire tonight, Lord. We want to know more of your story. We want to know more of your love for your people. So please send the spirit of enlightenment to us tonight, Lord. Illuminate the words for us and help us to understand them so that we might be doers and hearers of the word. And we ask all this in the mighty name of Jesus the Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen. All right, so they have divided up the land. Joshua and the leaders have cast lots. Each of the 12 tribes have got their land. Now, what they want to do is establish those cities of refuge. We've talked about them a couple of times already. God has demanded, or not demanded, He has told the Israelites that once they get settled in the land, they're supposed to set up these special cities called cities of refuge. And just a little reminder of the reason for that. God understands that from time to time accidents are going to happen, and one Israelite is going to accidentally kill another. But he also understands that the family members of the dead Israelite are going to try to take matters in their own hand because of anger, and he wants to have a way to preserve the blood of the innocent person who accidentally killed somebody. So he says, set up these cities. He said, start with 6, and then as your land grows, you'll have more of them. So now they actually assign these 6 cities of refuge where an accidental killer can run to and be given refuge for an accidental killing. So let's say I accidentally kill one of Janice's family members, and she swears revenge against me, and I take off running and she chases me. I get to one of these cities of refuge, get to the city gates, plead my case to the elders. They take me in. Janice is left holding the bag. She can't get into that city to get me. Now, there is kind of a little rule to this, so I'm safe as long as I'm in that city. I can't set foot out that city, or else my blood is on my own hands when her and her family take revenge. But there is a provision where I can go back home to my old city, and Janice and her family have to leave me alone. When the high priest of the town that I've run to the city of refuge, dies, then I am released from that, and I can go back to my hometown and go, you can't touch me, you can't touch me. So these are just kind of the rules. Now, as Moses commanded, or as God commanded to Moses, 6 cities were set aside. 3 of them were on the western side of the Jordan River in the actual promised land. 3 were set up on the eastern side where the 2.5 tribes decided they wanted to hang out because the land was so good. We're not going to really go name by name because it's not really important without a map to show you where they're at. But just know that there were 6 cities, 3 on the western side of Jordan, 3 on the eastern side. Now, chapter 21, we remember that the Levites, God said the Levites will have no inheritance in the promised land. They will not get a chunk of land to call their own. They are servants of God, and therefore they will be provided for by God through the sacrificial system. They will get any sacrifices brought to by the people to the priest. They get a portion of that. Well, they still have to have somewhere to live. So within each tribe's inheritance, land inheritance, a certain number of cities based on how many Levites are in that area will be set aside for the Levites to call their own city, along with some pasture land on the outside of the city for their livestock. So they set up 48 cities for the priests, or for the Levitical priests. And they do that because the Levite leaders come to Joshua after the land's all divvied up and says, Joshua, we don't want you to forget about God's promise through Moses to us to provide for us, since we don't have a land inheritance. So Israel allotted the Levites 48 cities, the pasture land around it, And these came from the inheritances of the other 12 tribes. So I'm guessing they're probably, if we went through and plotted them all out, they're probably spread pretty equally throughout the land. After that's done, Joshua talks to those 2.5 tribes whose land is on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Because remember, the deal was that Moses made with them, you can have this land over here, even though it wasn't part of the original land grant, but you still have to go and do your duty fighting with your brothers and sisters over on the western side. Well, the land has been given rest, the fighting's over, so Joshua calls these groups together and says, you have been released from your obligations, you're good to go back home. He gives them a reminder to follow the commands of the Lord, and he sends them back home with a blessing. Now, they go back across the Jordan River, and then they get to this place called, let's see what it was, they get to Gilead, near the Jordan River, in the land of Canaan, and these 2.5 tribes stop, and they build this, it says, an opposing altar right there by the Jordan. Now, their brothers and sisters on the other side of the Jordan River hear all about this. They're like, man, those eastern tribes just had barely left the land, and they're already setting up their own altar to worship to other gods, even though they know they're not supposed to do this. And so they think their eastern brothers and sisters have forsaken God, and they get together and they get ready to go to war against the eastern tribes. And so what happens is they get together as a delegation to go talk to the eastern tribes before they go over and destroy them. And it's led by a guy by the name of Phinehas. Does anybody remember that name? Does that name strike a remembrance? Phinehas. We've heard about him before. We've met him before. He is the son of Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron, the high priest. He was the guy that when they were still on the plains of Moab, and God has given them the instructions of do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't intermarry with these tribes and everything. And remember, a couple of Israelites just kind of wandered on in with the foreign women and go on into the tent nonchalant like it's. And Phinehas gets so enraged with holy zeal that he grabs that spear and he runs in and he jabs both of them, kills them both. And he is kind of uplifted in God's eyes as having a zeal for the Lord. So that same Phinehas, this is kind of like a hyperlink back to that episode, so you know that this guy, he doesn't put up with any shenanigans. Yeah. This is the guy that they picked to lead this delegation to go to the eastern tribe and say, you screwed up and we're going to wipe you out.
We know what he's capable of.
Yes, we know exactly what he's and why he's capable of doing it. So this is an important kind of a pointer of knowing who this guy is and why it's important. So he goes over there. They make the accusation against the eastern tribe saying, hey, you built this altar because you're going to make sacrifices to other gods and to God over here apart from the rest of it. And the eastern tribe say, actually, you kind of got that all wrong. Yes, we built this altar, but we have no intent of ever offering a sacrifice on it. We built this altar because we have a feeling that once we crossed over that Jordan River, that river was going to be a boundary between you guys and between us. And at some point, you guys would say, them fellas on the eastern side of the river, they don't have any share in God's inheritance. They're not part of us. And we thought that you would forget that we were still actually part of the nation of Israel. So we built this altar as a remembrance for all to see it and to know that we are all the one family, the one nation of Israel. He said, it's not to forsake the Lord, but it's to serve as a unifying symbol. So Phinehas hears this and he's actually pleased with it. He's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Well, guess what? We're not going to go to war and kill you all. And so war is avoided. The western tribes going back across the Jordan. Now, Joshua he's getting a little old, and kind of like the end of Deuteronomy, where Moses is a little long in the tooth, and he takes time to speak to the people before his impending death. It says, after a long time had passed, the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them. Joshua, by then, a very old man, summoned all of Israel and their elders, leaders, judges. So he called all the important people together, and he gives them a little bit of a pep talk. And he reminds them of God's faithfulness, everything that God has done for them up to this point. He reminds them again to keep God's commandments, and really keys on this, don't follow other gods. I want you to put a pin in that, remember that, because we're going to come back to that in very short order. We'll get to it tonight, I promise you. Don't follow other gods. And he reminds them that if they keep God's commandments, that things will go good, but if they don't, if they disobey God's commandments, that they will kindle God's wrath against them. Then he assembles all the tribes of Israel at this place called Shechem. Now, we've heard of Shechem before. It's a town there in this Canaanite area that they've just taken over. And it's time to renew the covenant again. And the covenant I speak of is that covenant that God made at Mount Sinai before they came to the Promised Land the first time, that they would be God's people and God would be their God. So, once again, Joshua tells the old story. This is a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament, where the story from the time that the Israelites are brought up out of Egypt until the present time is told. But this time, Joshua goes even further back, and Joshua reminds Israel of all God has done from Abraham, the father, the first quote-unquote father of the Israelites, what he'd done for him. Abraham. He says, you know what? I picked this guy from on the other side of the river. And when they're talking about the river, they're not talking about the Jordan. He's talking about the Refuge river. So I picked this guy way over there, and he worshiped foreign gods. His people worshiped foreign gods. I picked him up, a nobody, made him somebody, brought him over here, promised him to give this land to his ancestors, and then he kind of goes from there, from Abraham, and says, this is what God did. God did this, God did this, God did this, God did this, and now here we are. He tells Israel that they need to fear the Lord and to keep His commands. And then he says, you know, today you must choose who you're going to follow. Let's see how he puts it. Try to remember where. Let's see. Now fear the Lord and serve Him with all your faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your ancestors' worship beyond the Euphrates River. Let's see. I'm trying to remember where he says this. Anyway, I can't find it right here. But he says,
chapter 14?
This chapter 24, verse 14 and 15, yeah. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in the land in whose land you are living. And then he says those immortal words that we see on, wives love to get this inscribed and put in their house. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So he tells them that they got to choose whether they're going to follow foreign gods or whether they're going to follow Yahweh, the God of Israel. And then he says that he's going to choose the Lord. Now the people, they say, that's easy. We're going to follow God. Joshua says, yeah, right, sure you are. He says, man, you ain't going to. No, we promise, Joshua, we're going to follow God. And he says, really? So your own words are witnesses against you today. Today you are witnesses against yourselves. And they're like, you're right, we are. We promise we're going to follow God. He said, yeah, right. This is not, I promise you're not going to be able to follow him. But he says, look, the covenant between God and between you is now renewed here at Shechem. After these things, Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at an age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. So Joshua dies, 110, buried there in a town in his land inheritance. Now, 110, we see that, like, okay, man, he lived ripe old age and move on. This is actually a pretty important number. This is the same age that Joseph was when he died in Egypt. And we're about to have a quick little tie in there, because you remember when before Joseph died, he made his grandkids, Manasseh and Ephraim, promise, don't leave me here in this land. Don't have me involved. Don't leave me here. Bring my bones up out. Because Joseph knew that Israel was going to be going on at some point, 400 years down the road, that they would be going on the promised land. He knew that Egypt wasn't meant to be their permanent home. So he says, make sure you bring my bones and don't lay them to rest until we get to the promised land. So 110, there's that tie in there from Joshua back to Joseph. It was also considered an ideal lifespan. So the people, when the nations around that were still in that area, when they saw that he lived to 110, it would have been, in their eyes, a divine blessing. Like, this is the perfect age to die. It was something that would have been, they would have known intrinsically. The author tells us that Israel served God during Joshua's life and the elders who outlived him. So this generation is going to follow God. Now, Joseph's bones, which he had his ancestors promised to bring up out of there, and they've been carrying this old bag of bones around for 400 and some odd years. They finally laid these bones to rest at that town called Shechem. And where he had them laid to rest is land that his father Jacob bought years earlier when remember when Jacob swindled Esau out of his blessing and his inheritance? And Esau swore he was going to kill him, and when his father Isaac died, Mama said, you need to go over there and live with your uncle Laban for a while. When Jacob is coming back to meet with Esau, because the Lord says, go on back, promise you everything's going to be fine, he stopped at this place and he bought this land from the Canaanites who were living there at the time. And so 400 years later, we find ourselves right back here, and Jacob is being buried in the land where his dad bought 400 years later. And this is Joseph's descendants' inheritance. Now, Aaron's son Eleazar, which is the father to Phinehas, he also dies at this time, around this time, and is buried in Gibeah. These deaths, there's 2 deaths and the 3 burials, this is a way that the author of Joshua uses to mark the end of the story. It is like a major chapter in the story of Israel is ending here. They have finally made it to the promised land. And it's the end of the era, which is the wandering to get to this promised land. The fact that Joseph's bones are buried here 400 years after he died establishes for us literarily that God has fulfilled his promise and the Israelites are now home. This is their forever home. They are done being wanderers, which they've been wanderers, foreigners in the land ever since Abraham passed through. So now that's over. There it is. That's the book of Joshua. Now, we move on to the book.
Can I ask one thing?
You get asked, how many of things you
Moses, nobody knows where he was buried. God buried him.
True.
Was that so he wouldn't be brought into a promised land?
Wow. I have never thought about it. I thought about it enough to say, gee, I wonder why God never revealed where Moses was buried. But he did promise Moses that he would never make it to the promised land, and I can see.
Because they probably would have wanted to bring him up.
Yeah, they would have lifted up his bones and brought him on over across the river, which would have, theologically, I think that works, because when God says, look, you ain't going,
Right.
he means for all eternity, not just while you're alive. So I think theologically there's a point to be made for that. If I was to write a paper on that, I think I could.
You could be somebody.
Well, I don't think I could be somebody, but I think I could take your thesis there.
You can make an argument.
I could make a good solid argument for it, yeah. I think you're probably right. Of course, there will come a day when we can ask God ourselves.
Right.
Why did you hide Moses?
Moses might ask me first.
And Moses probably like, why did you hide me? Because I told you you weren't getting over there. Not even your bones are getting over there. All right, so Joshua kind of wraps up. Now, it doesn't wrap up all the fighting. Israel will be fighting for the rest of the Old Testament. They'll be fighting on and off. But it does mark the end of the era. Now, we turn the page, we get into Judges, and the first 2 and a partial chapters is about the incomplete conquest of the land. They didn't quite finish the job. You remember what the Lord demanded of the Israelites before they crossed that Jordan River and entered the Promised Land? What did he tell them? Kill everybody there. Don't let anybody live. And the nations that are a little further out, just drive them out. And then God also promised to drive some people out. Do you remember why God demanded this of the Israelites? Why they had to kill everybody and purge the land?
Because he didn't want to drag them down. Or he didn't want to.
He didn't want all those gods.
Yeah. God knew that the Israelites' heart were not going to be able to stay fully focused on Him, and that if the people stayed there, that eventually there'd be a pretty little Canaanite lady that would catch the eye of an Israelite man, and they'd get married, and then the Israelites would start off down paths. Not that it's the Canaanite woman's fault. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that God knew that the people groups being in close proximity, the standards that He had for the Israelites were too high, and the stakes were too great for coexistence, that it would not work out. That Israelites needed to be in a land by themselves to be pure. So, beginning in chapter 1, Joshua's dead. The Israelites go to the Lord and say, who is the first of us that needs to go up and fight against the Canaanites? So not all the Canaanites were out of the land yet. And the Lord said, Judah, tribe of Judah, you go up first. And so the men of Judah go up, and with God's help, they start by purging out the Canaanites and the Perizzites from the land. They end up at this town called Bezek, and they strike down 10,000 men at Bezek. And they capture the king of Bezek, and his name is Adonai, which means my Lord, Bezek, Adonai Bezek. Not very original, naming a guy after the town that he's the king of. But they capture him, and they don't kill him. He flees, but they chase him, they catch him. They don't kill him. What they do is they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Now, when I read that, I was like, well, why in the heck did they do that? Well, thank goodness the author of Judges gives us the answer in the very next verse. Adonai Bezek says 70 kings, 70 being a metaphorical number. It's a number 7 or 70 or 7 times 10. It's divine completeness. Not sure what that has to do with this, but 70 kings have, with their thumbs and toes cut off, have picked up scraps under my table. In other words, he has dominated a lot of people in his time and forced them to pick up scraps in a disfigured way. And he said, now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him back to Jerusalem. He dies there. And that's the end of that guy. Judah goes down and continues fighting and does what they need to. However, the tribes of Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Dan, and I think Zebulun, all of those tribes fight against the people, the foreigners, well, not the foreigners, the indigenous people, we'll call them that, the indigenous people to the land that they're supposed to purge out. They fight against them. Judah drives the people out they're supposed to. These tribes do not. And those the locals end up being a part of their landscape, and it's not going to end well. So, an angel shows up, chapter 2. An angel shows up and speaks on behalf of the Lord and says, I brought you up out of Egypt, led you to this land, swore to give it to your ancestors, and yet you've disobeyed me. Why have you done this? What do you think they did to disobey him? They didn't drive the people out, right? They didn't kill everybody. He said, I will not, let's see, you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. So they ended up making deals and treaties and stuff with these people. And he said, so I'm not going to drive these people out before you, and they will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. When the angel spoke, then the people wept aloud, and they offered sacrifice to the Lord. But I think it's a little too late at that time. After, let's see.
It's like, kind of keeps repeating itself, huh?
Yes. I mean, we got this far to go. Let's see. Okay. We still have that much in the Old Testament to go. We've only been through that far, and you've already seen it back. And that pattern's going to repeat right until this page right here. And so, Joshua, he dies, and we know from the last book that the people follow God. Now that Joshua's dead, at least until all the elders that were of that same generation as Joshua dies off. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, the Bible says, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. In other words, it's like, who's this God guy? What's he done for us lately? I know them old stories you tell about Egypt and all that, but what's he done for us lately? So the next generation forgot what the Lord had done for Israel, and we start to see a turn that we will see over and over and over again for the next few books. And they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forsook the Lord. They worshipped these gods called Baal and Ashereth. Baal was the Canaanite god of, well, he was like the supreme god of the Canaanites. Specifically, they worshiped Baal for fertility. Ashereth was a female goddess, and she was known as the mother god. So she would have been like Baal's wife. Incidentally, the name's not Baal, it's Baal. And she would have been Baal's wife. So together they would have made quite a pair of deities. And so the Canaanites worshiped these two. They built altars to them. They built these things called Asherah poles. They were like totem poles. They would put these in near the altars of Baal so they could worship both. And that's what the Israelites now are doing. They're worshiping Baal. They're worshiping Asherah. And I'm just going to go on a limb here and say that God is not too pleased with this new development with the Israelites. So what God does is God allows them to be defeated by their neighbors. The people that they failed to drive out, the people that then God said, because you messed up, I'm not going to drive them out, and they're going to be snares to you. God basically turns them over to their own devices. See, God does not necessarily take an active hand in his people's downfall. He simply, what's the term the old folks would use, Dickie? Give them enough rope to hang themselves? Yeah. I'm sure you had a granddaddy that said that. Yeah. I know my granddaddy did. So that's what God does. God just gives you enough rope to hang himself. That's what he does here. He lets them fall to their own devices, and at some point they realize they're in really deep trouble, and they're in great distress. So what God does is he starts raising up these leaders that are called judges. They're not judges in the way that we understand, and I know you're going to be watching there, Judge Shockley. Not a judge like Judge Shockley, but these were more like mini kings or rulers that would have been able to settle disputes like a judge, i.e. the term judge, but they were also rallying points for military campaigns, and in some cases, which we'll see some of these judges will go through, they actually go out and do the physical fighting on behalf of the Israelites. So now, the people are turning their hearts from God. They're worshiping other gods. God lets them to fall victim to their own devices, and then he raises up leaders. So how do you think this is going to work out? You think this is going to end good? I'm guessing this is not going to end too good. All right. So the first judge that we have recorded is a guy named Othniel. So the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot their Lord, served the Baals, the Asherahs, and the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them over into the hands of the king of Aram. Now Aram, we've heard of them before. Aram's up about in here, north of the Sea of Galilee, right there. Modern day Syria would be where Aram is. So the king of Aram brings all his forces down and they oppress him. And I believe he is, they're conquered by the Aramites for about 8 years until they finally humble themselves enough. They know they're in deep trouble and they call out to God for help. And so God raises up this guy, Othniel, and he defeats their enemies, and it brings peace for 40 years. It says, so the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So as long as Othniel was sitting in the judge's seat, the Israelites did what they were supposed to. He dies, 40 years later, peace is over. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Because they did this evil, the Lord gave the king of Moab, which is down across the Jordan River over by the Dead Sea, down towards the southern area, southeast side. Moab, there you go. Gives the Moabites power over Israel. You want us to wait on you to come back, Nicky?
I'm going to get a drink of water.
Oh, you're getting a drink of water. Okay, so
I'm getting a bottle of water. I'm really
Gotcha.
trying to get this tickle out in the throat.
So this time, God lets Israel be conquered for 18 years. Until, once again, they humble themselves, say, man, we're in a spot. We need God's help. God said, oh, you're going to turn back to me now, huh? Well, all right. Let me raise you up another judge. So they've been without a judge for 18 years. He raises up this guy named Ehud. And Ehud, he's a left-handed man.
So each tribe didn't have a judge.
No. This is an overall thing.
Right.
Yeah, at this point. That may change later, I can't remember, but I don't think so.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. And so he raises up Ehud, a left-handed man, and he's actually from the tribe of Benjamin.
That's why,
Right. Yeah, that's why you asked, okay. But even though he was from the tribe of Benjamin, he was the judge for the whole nation of Israel. So Ehud, he has a double-edged sword made, and he goes to the Moabite king, and he pretends to have a secret message. He stops at the guard and says, hey, got a message for the king. They're like, well, what is it? We'll go tell him. Can't tell you. Got delivered in person. I mean, this is top shelf secret stuff. I could tell you, but then I have to kill you. You don't want that. Just let me in to see the king. And so he goes in, talks to the king. King kicks out all of his attendants because Ehud says, king, this is only for yours only. They don't need to hear this. Like, all right, get ready. So they're in the king's inner chamber, right, in his bedroom. Kicks everybody out, locks the chamber door. He tells Ehud, he's got a message for you from God. He's like, God. He says, here's your message. Pulls that sword out, stabs the king in his belly. His bowels discharge. In other words, he pooped himself. And Ehud runs out the window. Now, the guards are standing outside. They're like, man, that guy's been in there a long time. I'm sure they're looking and say, hey, Guard Joe, you think we ought to go in and check on the king? Like, I think he's in the bathroom. That's what they thought. They thought he was relieving himself. They're like, we ain't going to go and mess with the king while he's on the throne, right? And so they think he's relieving himself. So Ehud has a good head start. He gets away. And then eventually the king's found. But Ehud then leads Israel against the Moabites and ends up defeating the Moabites. Then the land had peace for 80 years. So they're at peace for 80 years. Doesn't say that Ehud died. It's just, I'm guessing that he probably lived about 80 more years and then died, which brings that. After Ehud, this guy named Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, he too saved Israel. So he gets, this guy Shechem gets one little verse. But he was a judge, didn't do much. And then we get to a lady named Deborah, first female judge. Actually, first, female leader we see, unless you want to count Eve a leader, because Adam pretty much did what Eve told him to do. For good or for bad. But this is the first female leader that God raises up. Chapter 4, again, Israelite does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now the Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold him in the hands of the king of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Now, he had a commander named Sisera. Let's see, get my page in order here. He had a commander named Sisera, and he had 900 chariots fitted with iron, and he cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. So they're under oppression for 20 years until they finally humble themselves and say, you know what, we might be messing up. Let's ask God for help again. So they call out to the Lord for help. And Deborah, the prophet, was leading Israel at that time. So she goes to this guy named Barak. She goes to Barak and says, I want you to go up and to take 10,000 men and defeat our enemies, who's led by the commander named Sisera. He says, sounds like you got a good battle plan, but I don't want to go there by myself. Deborah, I tell you what, you go with me and I'll go. Oh, man, can't I get you to do anything on your own? She goes, fine. I'll tell you what, I'll go with you, but you're not going to get the glory. A woman is going to get the glory for you. I mean, we're going to win. I'm telling you, we're going to win, but you're not going to get any glory. A woman's going to get the glory. Sisera will be delivered into the hands of a woman. So they go up, take their 10,000 people up, and they fight this good fight. And the commander, Sisera, runs away, and he takes off running. He sees a tent. He's like, man, I bet you I can hide in that tent. And so he runs to the tent, and he comes to the tent of Jael, who is the wife of a guy named Heber. And she says, oh, I think I know you. You're that guy that commands all the chariots. Oh, you're running away. You need someplace to hide? Come on in. I got your back. So she brings him in. She gives him some nice warm milk to settle his stomach and get him nice and drowsy. And she goes, why don't you just lay down here and have a nice little nap? Which he does. She covers him up, gets him all comfy. And then she takes a tent peg while he's sleeping and drives it through his forehead, or through his temple, and kills him. And that fulfilled what Deborah had told Barak, where the commander of the army was actually delivered into the hands of a woman. So Barak ends up singing a song of glory to the Lord about Deborah. He's singing, man, God just gave us a great woman here to lead us. And the land had peace for about 40 years after that. So what we're seeing is a succession of leaders that are risen up at just the right time. So Israel does good. Well, first they do evil. They fall victim to the people around them. They call out on the Lord. The Lord will lift up a leader, a judge. Things will go well for a while. Then they'll do evil in the eyes of the Lord. So yes, Judges is going to be a revolving door of judges and of Israelites doing the same stupid stuff and getting in the same stupid trouble. Now, we're at a natural stopping point here. I know we're 15 minutes early, but that'll give us plenty of time if you want to make any observations or ask any questions. Because we're going to get in the story of Gideon. I know Gideon's probably, you might not know all of his exploits, but it's a name that we know well from the Bible. And it's about 3 chapters long. I don't have time to go through all of his stuff tonight. So we're going to stop and save him for another week. So, man, those Israelites.
Man.
Any thoughts or?
Are the judges chosen from tribe by tribe? Is there a sequence?
I haven't looked. There might be a pattern. I have to go and look.
I didn't know if there was a reason that was somebody in the tribe did something, that now they need a judge to take care of this particular avenue.
It could be, however, we're not given the context. The only context we're given, when God lifts up the judges, they do evil in the eyes of the Lord, they become oppressed, and then they finally call on the Lord for help. So we don't know necessarily every time what they did that was evil, who did it, and the corresponding reason why that particular judge was lifted up.
It looks like they're just selected, God just chose certain people.
Yep, he's like,
Not-
eeny, meeny, miny, hey, Tommy, you're a judge for the
He
next 80
doesn't
years.
say anything about there being a specific tribe, but Eglon was from Moab.
I didn't know if somebody in that tribe started something, and now so you're gonna
You got to take care of what your people started, yeah. And very well could be. I might go back and look for a pattern, see if I see a pattern. Eglon was from the Moabites, so he wasn't Israelite. He was an oppressor. But yeah, I know Ehud came from the tribe of Benjamin, but I didn't look. And Deborah, what did it say where Deborah was?
I didn't see that.
Now Deborah, a prophet, wife of Lapidoth, she held court under the palm of Deborah, so she had a tree named after her. In the hill country of Ephraim. So she's in Ephraim. I'm guessing she's an Ephraimite. So she'd be from the tribe of Ephraim. Barak came from Naphtali, so he was from the tribe of Naphtali. But he wasn't a judge. He was just coming to her. So, yeah, I'll look into that.
I was trying to follow that while you were talking, and I was getting really confused because they were talking about the people that they were supposed to be fighting against. And I wasn't really sure where these people came from, so I was getting a little.
Where the judges came from?
Yeah, it said that God lifted them up to do things or to, but it looks like they're just selected people.
But they weren't elected by the people.
Oh,
No,
no. God raises them up.
He raised
And
them up.
that's a great question. I want you to hold on to that, and I'm going to tell you why. Because, first of all, God is the supreme leader of Israel at this point. Judges are simply really no different than Moses or Joshua, just somebody that God picked, lifted up to lead, except the judges were for a much shorter period of time, or much more limited in their scope than Moses or Joshua was, but they're still appointed by God, not by the people. And we will come, when we finish up, we'll do Judges, and then Ruth is kind of like, the book of Ruth is just kind of like a little parenthetical within the time of the Judges. When we get to Samuel, then we'll see the people like,
Well, it says.
why do we have a king like everybody around us? Give us a king,
It says that Orthanel, or whatever his name is, was the first deliverer, and he was from a southern group. And then
Yeah, Othniel, let's see where Othniel came from.
Ehud was a left-handed Benjaminite. So,
I wonder why left-handed is important in that.
because he was the son of the right hand. That's what,
Is that what it says?
that's the Benjamin.
I read some scholarly work on that one time, and I'm trying to remember what they had to say about it. I think it was something about, because he concealed the sword.
But he had it on his right side.
Had it on his right side, right. And so, being left-handed, sword on his right side, when he went in, he's hiding under his cloak. He goes in and talks to the king. The king got his message.
Right.
In your gut, king. From what I remember, there was something significant about sword being on his right side, being left-handed, and being able to do it without raising the king's suspicion. Something about that. But I can't put my finger on it now. It's been too many years since I read it. But yeah, the author went to great pains to point out the fact he was left-handed. So, and that the sword was on his right side until it ended up in the belly of the king, which was not a good place for it.
I guess even back then, there was way more right-handed people than there were left-handed people. And it was assumed that somebody was writing.
Yeah, you're like, hey, king, look what's going on here.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, Peter cut off the guard's ear when he come
Mm-hmm.
for Jesus, and didn't it say it cut off the guard's right ear? So
Um,
did that imply he was
I
left-handed?
think it did say,
I was just trying to find, I don't remember exactly where the reference was.
let's see what happened that
I
night.
don't mean to get down a rabbit hole that you never.
No, that's right. We got a little time just for this. Let's see. The man stepped forward, sees Jesus. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his. Okay, and Matthew it just says cutting off his ear. So try Luke 22. Mark Luke 22 is another iteration of the story. Last Supper. Jesus arrested.
Did you say it was?
Cutting off his right ear. Okay, so and one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. Luke 22, 50, or 40, 50.
And I always heard that was because he was left-handed, because when he did this, it presented the
Right.
right ear.
Yep, my right ear, your left hand. Unless you come across my body, which is a little more difficult cutting, I guess.
I wonder if the left-handed, I mean, I just wonder if there's a symbol to.
There's probably some reason. Yeah. So,
I'm still dealing with all these thumbs and toes being missing.
I'm telling you, thumbs and toes. Cutting them off. Me and Dickie are already well on our way, right? I got my little piece of nose there.
You
Well,
never know how much you miss that little thing there.
Oh, I can only imagine, and you're right-handed, so when you reach for your coffee cup, I know I hook my coffee cup with that finger.
How do you hold a pencil out, or a pen? Can you still?
I like that.
You
I
just
never could write well anyway, so that's my handwriting that failed.
well, Six Finger Bob, he lost his right finger. He has his right thumb, but he just about lost his middle finger on his left hand. It looks like a catfish or something. It's weird looking.
He was showing me the other day all the things. I said, Bobby, you are an accident-prone man. I'm sure there's one or two that he hadn't bothered to tell you about either.
I'm quite sure.
Yeah, I made it a long time without getting that. Out of all the hazards I've had, but
Using
I
an
did finally
alligator.
get it into something that grabbed my glove, chain on the
Alligator bit.
pig bail, grabbed my glove, and the injury was called gloves, which meant it jerked all the meat off the bone.
Any other observations, questions, or comments on what we went over tonight? I know we covered quite a bit. We'll get into Gideon's a great story.
Good story, it's doing real well.
Yeah.
No movement, that's good.
Yeah, we'll probably do Gideon. Let's see, how many chapters are in here? I know Ruth only has 4. There's 20 chapters, 21 chapters. I don't think
all these different people that live in that area, are they the same people that live there now? They just got
descendants of them.
different names?
Yeah. Well, you think about the Arabs. They come from the line of Ishmael, which was Abraham's first son, his illegitimate son. That was they became the Arabic people in that area, the ethnic Arabs. Of course, the Israelites, the Jews, the Hebrew people, are from the line of Isaac. If you go all the way back to Genesis to when Noah came on, the Canaanites actually come from one of Noah's sons, I believe it's Ham. Can't descend from Ham, and Ham has a couple. So it's really, I think Genesis chapter 9 is where they have the table of nations, and you can see where all these people came from. But without going back and trying to chase genealogy today, those are the two major distinctions. So,
Israel's been fought over by so many countries over the years. I think that's how they got so scattered when they tried to come back.
Now, and you think of that same area right now, you got what we refer to as Jordanians and now and the Palestinians and
of course, you got
and
Syrians
and Lebanese and You know they're probably descendants of the same people that.
Oh,
Yeah, they are, but we had pretty good lineage through the Old Testament until we got to the end of the Old Testament. We could tell kind of who belonged to who, but now we're so far removed from it all that it's hard to say with any certainty, well, these were the Canaanites and these were the Amorites.
Well, I don't really understand all the fighting about the West Bank and this and that and the other. Is that because it's going back to the biblical doctrine of trying to reclaim the West
Yes.
Bank? Because that's where the Palestinians are.
Right. So after the Jews were scattered in exile, not all of them came back. And when they, in fact, only 2 tribes come back, Judah and I think Benjamin. 2 southern tribes. The 10 northern tribes are lost forever. But when they come back, they don't necessarily ever really reconstitute the tribal lands the way they did. And so, in modern time, of course, after, you got the Greeks come, well, first you got the Persians, then you got the Greeks come in after the Persians, and it becomes, under Greek control. Then the Romans after the Greeks, and then after the Romans, then it was the Turks,
The Turks.
the Ottoman Empire. And now we see back in the early 20th century where the Hebrews, the Jews come back and try to reconstitute a nation, a geopolitical entity, which they did, and then they've been expanding pretty much ever since. And, Gaza, the West Bank, all that was at one point part of the Promised Land. Of course, now how do we balance that? It was given to them for a reason and for a season, and under the terms of the covenant which they broke. Do the Palestinians have a valid claim to the land since they've been there? In Israel, doesn't matter which side of the argument you're on, Israel come in and expelled who was living in the land at that time, much like they did with God's blessing one time before. So that's why the fighting is there. Israel's trying to expand back to what they had. I don't know whether that's right or wrong. I don't.
Yeah, I know people who feel both ways about it, and some of them are Christians and what as well, but they say that, since it was fought for, it wasn't, and they left it, and the Palestinians have lived there.
Right.
And then I was thinking about this when we were talking about all the different nations around. I had 2 guys who used to work with me, and one of them was from Lebanon, and he's got a farm in Springfield. His name is Adham, and which is Adam. And then the other one's name was Abraham, and he was Syrian. He was from Damascus. So, and I just thought about, because I always wondered why they had those names that were related to the Hebrew, and they were obviously, well, Adham's a Christian, but Abraham's a Muslim.
A lot of people, what they miss, and I didn't know this until recently, within the last 5 years, you see the fight in Israel as between the Jews and the Muslims, right? The PLA, Palestinian Liberation, they're Muslim. What we tend to forget is a lot of those Palestinians over there are Christians, and they're caught in the middle. The Muslims don't want them, the Jews don't want them. In fact, before Israel came in and reclaimed that territory, there was probably like 30% of the people in that area were Christians. Today, there's less than 2%. Wow. Christians are such a minority in that area, in the Middle East. So, yeah. Well, I think that's about all we got time for today. It was a great study, and I hope y'all enjoyed it. And whoever watches the video, I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Go in peace. See you next week. Hey folks, remember to click the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be notified when we post new content. And as always, if today's video touched you in some way, please hit the thumbs up button and leave us a comment. We love to hear how our content impacts your walk with Jesus Christ. Until next time, God bless.